Thank you very much, Floyd. Thank you, Itergy, for this session and joining us. So without further ado, I'm going to run into the presentation. So you'll notice the new look. What we keep asking, what is the new normal? The new normal is now wearing headsets. So that's one piece of breaking news for you if you hadn't worked it out already. The good thing is that wearing a headset does keep the hair down for those that couldn't get to a decent hairdresser because they're all closed. So what we're going to do is look at what organizations should be now thinking about and how we got into a current situation and what is really needs to be at the top of the focus point. And this is based on, Quest is a global, one of the leading IT companies out there. We cover a broad portfolio, working in every area of industry. So this is an amalgamation of the conversations that I've been having with senior leaders as well as people close to my heart, technical people, to actually decide what we need to do next. What has come apparent is that organizations in the past have built on their existing model, and we need to move away from this. And what's happened recently has really underlined for many organizations why we need to think of things in a different light. I'm not saying every organization is like this, but even if you are well on your way to being a mature, secure, remote, flexible organization, it's worth following these steps as we are doing as well as Quest. So we need to redefine our approach. And why do we need to do that? Organizations, as far as security is concerned, have been stuck in this loop of incremental updates. We've been expanding on a model that maybe doesn't represent what we should be doing today. And all that has done is end up growing what we call technical debt. We're servicing both financially and through manpower and effort, systems that may not be appropriate. So what we need to do is draw a line under that and really consider, go back to first principles and go back to what we need to do as an organization, what is important to us. Before we do that, let's have a look at why the current model isn't the best for us. And the current model is, well, the foundation model may not be current for everyone right now, but it's the concept of we must prevent all breaches. And this came about because we have traditionally gone with the firewalls, hard outer shell, protecting from outside entities trying to get into our assets, and then internally stopping the exfiltration of our important information, data, and so on. But the prevent all breaches methodology, which is very hard outer shell and maybe some subdivisions as well, it doesn't take into account that what it does is it's recording every entry, every breach of any particular part as a failure from our side. And that isn't a failure. A failure is when the assailant gets in, gets what they want, and exfiltrates what they want to do, or executes whatever they had in mind. There are many steps to that. So the prevent all breaches doesn't take that into account. We consider everything a failure in this model, and that's just simply not true. It also doesn't take into account how we are protecting with zero trust our important data. Again, we're looking at a firewall model rather than a model of what is important to us and what additional steps and processes we have in place to ensure that who is accessing it really is those people. It's not designed that way. And then finally, and this is one that people don't realize, you have this prevent all breaches model. It actually allows very little ability to react quickly and timely, and we'll go into that in more detail. Quickly and timely in when you have a breach, a significant breach, or the start of a breach. So there's three primary reasons why we don't want to maintain this prevent all breaches concept. So we need to go back to consider what is a modern security model. So the first thing we need to do is we need to have a way of measuring. As we said, a breach isn't necessarily a breach. They may not achieve their objectives. They may actually do nothing at all except get through a firewall and then get nowhere else. So what we need to do is focus on what the adversary campaign is, what their end goal is, and measuring when they achieve their goal. That is then a good metric for us because it means something, and that's going to be more important as we see the next two. So when we're looking at that goal, we now need to invest in stopping a successful campaign, breaking that chain of events that needs to happen, rather than simply investing on trying to prevent everything. Let's prevent a successful a sequence of events. And also, and this is the most important thing, that where we, considering the previous two, understand what is of material impact to your organization. The finance database is not the same material impact or value to your organization as, let's say, the canteen dinner SharePoint site. But with the preventable breaches model, it is. So this is where we need to start looking at where we need to invest, because we cannot afford, no one can afford to invest everything they have in that preventable breaches model and be successful. So when we say what's material impact, key thing there, so one thing is our assets. That could be our intellectual property, our financial, our personal information that we're holding, our client information, our contracts, given digital or physical assets that we really need to be protecting. And I say physical because what we're going to understand is what's at the heart of our security model. That isn't just protecting our digital assets. It's also protecting things like door entry systems, gateway systems, the systems printing identity cards, anything like that, management systems. These are physical as well as digital assets. We also need to look at our supply chain. We may not be the target. We may be a stepping stone to a more valuable target. So we need to understand that we're being attacked because of who we are in our supply chain, as well as is our supply chain being attacked and then affecting us. So it's a two-way piece. But as far as an asset is concerned, our participation in the supply chain is vital. It could be against an individual, of course, and that could be internal, external, but also the reputation of organization could be the target. Again, it may be just a simple grievance, or it could be cyber espionage, where they're actually trying to gain a bigger market share by depreciating your reputation within that market. So who's doing this? Who are the actors? Well, yes, external and internal. And when you talk about cybersecurity, external is number one. That's why I put it above. And then internal, of course, is number two. But this is a key point. When we're talking about actors for cybersecurity, these are people that are deliberately going out to do something that will harm your organization in some way. Now, this doesn't take into account the insider threat. And this is a key piece of terminology here, because insider threat includes negligence and those people that are being manipulated, clicked on links, phishing, and so on. So we need to bear in mind that the external are the actors, and they're the number one for the threat. We have internal actors, disgruntled employees, admins, so on like that. But what we're seeing is that externally it's organized crime. It used to be other threats, but organized crime has taken a massive leap forward. But internal threat is on the rise, so deliberate acts are going up. Then if we look at the motives, again, no surprise, it's financial. But cyber espionage is also, well, it's a key piece. And I think when we see more recent reporting coming out over the last 12 months, or what will be the last 12 months at the end of the year, we're going to see, I think, that espionage has gone significantly higher because of the environment that we're in right now. It will not oversee financial, but the espionage, especially around medical innovations and research, is going to drive that proportion higher. But financial remains the number one. So, and recent reports are showing that that perspective it's taking more share of the motives from the others. So the reason why we're talking about that is all of this centers around your Active Directory, and in that I also include your hybrid, your Azure Active Directory, because commonly Active Directory, even if you have other authentication services, Active Directory is at the heart of it, single point of truth, participates in the workflow. Again, given recent changes and also the directions that we'd be going in before what's happened recently with the adoption of cloud and so on, our security model and our compliance is in a state of flux. So recent months, organizations have had to face a challenge. Do we keep going? Do we keep the lights on? And what are the risks? And the risk side have been diminished in perspective, but they haven't gone away. There have been no changes to, for example, data regulations. Except that you're more lenient time for responding to requests for data, but reporting threats, reporting attacks, and breaches hasn't changed. Your responsibilities haven't changed. Your considerations haven't changed. And that's just data. But all the other risks involved in going to a remote workforce and more flexibility. So there's a lot of decisions that have been recently made. Our end users from a lot of places have now got an enhanced cyber threat. They're operating in a hostile network environment, which is their homes, which are not as protected. Possibly even the endpoint devices are not being updated sufficiently or frequently as you would have liked. And people are quite creative, so they may have found new ways of sharing or accessing or collaborating, which have opened you up to additional cyber threat. Plus, of course, recent motives. The criminals know this. They know how to get into your head, and they've been tapping away at trying to do that. So we need to reevaluate the recent decisions that we've made over the last few months. Really just revisit them, and everyone needs to do this regardless of your maturity model. We then need to know what we have learnt, what works and what didn't work. Some things, preconceptions such as the performance of the employees, the ability for people to work remotely, which was always possibly considered to be not as efficient as it was in the office, has changed. In fact, we've seen a rise in efficiency in general across the board. So redefining what we think is good for our organization, and then a phased return to normal, because we are in a state of flux and we don't want to rush back and cause problems or overhead that we may need to undo quickly, especially if we're now introducing a lot of devices and people that have been exposed to additional threat that introducing may present a significant threat to our central organization. So in other words, we need to work out what is important and understand what is temporary. And this is a methodology that we go through. So one area that we need to consider and that comes up is least privilege and zero trust. And what we mean by that is, rather than that hard outer shell around our environment only, we now need to consider the individual and the assets and everything else that they're using. In fact, everything that interfaces with them. From the operating systems, the applications they use, they could all be coerced or corrupted. Our suppliers, our supply chains could be used against us. Our co-workers, sharing of passwords, sharing of resources, our administrators having to work in difficult times or with reduced access, maybe making mistakes. So not deliberate, but it may actually be opening us to more problems. So having this concept of least privilege only by basically providing people with only what they need, and we do that by constantly monitoring what they're doing, not making assumption, and also reevaluating, do they really need to go there? Should they be going there from where they're coming from? Is this an appropriate time to do this? So hard outer shell around the individual, the smallest component, and then working out from then. And we do the same with assets and applications and so on. So each one of these become their own entity that we need to consider protection. The problem is that if we leap into this without insights and understanding what we're doing, we are going to end up with a lot of process failures. We're going to break things. We're also going to get complaints and frustrations, and people are going to adapt and then try and find new and innovative ways of doing things that they shouldn't necessarily have done. Users are great at finding loopholes. So administrators, let's face it, they're the cleverest people on the network. So when we're considering our response posture, we need to aim in this new world for the 1-10-60 rule. And what I mean by one, hopefully you've heard this before. So 1 minute, you have 1 minute on average to detect the start of a breach. We then have 10 minutes to understand that breach, get visibility. Is it really a breach? Where is it going? What sort of threat does it pose? What assets is it involving, human and physical and digital? And then finally, we have 60 minutes to resolve it. And the reason why we have this 1-10-60, if you haven't seen this before, is because on average, an assailant, an attacker, a bad actor, once they've entered your network, it takes 1 hour and 58 minutes, very precise, to then start moving laterally across. And once they start doing that, they gain persistence. And then it's very difficult and easy to get rid of them. That's when you start losing data, and it becomes a significant breach. So how we do this is follow this simple processes, really, or simple layers. First thing we need to do is insight. We need to understand where our risks are. We need to understand then from those whether we have least privileged and understand what normal looks like for our current user model. We need to monitor what's going on, looking for unusual behavior across the board. When we detect that, we need to inform the right people, and that could be the account themselves. If it may be that they've lost their credentials and they don't realize that they're under threat, or they're running something that they shouldn't. So informing the right people quickly, and then you need to react. And that reaction needs to be as automated as possible to give you that advantage, locking things down, just stopping them moving to that next layer. Remember when we talked about trying to stop a successful chain of events, or at least make it slow and get in the way. The more difficult we can make it, the better. And we're usually centering all of this around Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. So what our resilient model starts to look like then at the end of the day is we are encompassing our individuals and our assets. We're locking everything down. We're understanding the relationship between them. We are still maintaining a boundary. That boundary is expanded out to our SaaS and our cloud solutions as well. So we have a single visibility. And then we have these. We have a clear path of where we want to go based on current learning, what we've just understood about changes that we may have made, and the decisions that got us there. We have a material focus, and we have a way of measuring what we do. And to do that, we need visibility and insights as to what's going on. I know these are great words that we band around a lot, but it is vitally important. As Ralph's going to explain in a lot more depth, is the examples of why this is so important to do. We want to consider and implement, where possible, not a big bang approach, least privilege and zero trust. Start concentrating on the assets that mean something to our organization. And then our response needs to be quick, automated where possible. And I put response and recovery in there because at the end of the day, we're going to be reacting to a change in the environment. We need to be able to recover from whatever we're doing or whatever the change had been, whether it was intentional, malicious, accidental, through negligence. Either way, we need to restore safely. Restore is the ultimate thing that we're going to do. That's going to be the difference between the organization being down for 2 weeks, or as we've seen recently in the press, an organization managed to pick itself up after a cyber attack within 8 hours. So what I'm going to do now, because you're looking for a lot more information, a lot more detail, is I'm going to hand over to Ralph, who's going to go through some really good examples. So Ralph, thank you, and over to you.
Okay, thanks, Colin, for that great presentation. And I really like what you said about a strategy that takes into account 2 aspects. We must protect against any breach, but we won't stop all breaches. So we must build in resilience in order to restore our environments to be up and running within acceptable time and cost limitations. And that's not something that happens automatically. That's something where we need to really be prepared for that. And as Colin, you pointed out, it's not going to be, when it's not possible, we have to determine what level is material to your company. How will you respond when there has been a breach? And so this whole continuity versus risk continuum is really, really important. We've been known at Itergy for years as being the Active Directory specialists, and that's led us into identity and a whole lot of other things that connect into Active Directory. And our biggest competition was often those that said best effort is good enough. But sometimes best effort is not good enough. Companies, organizations believed they had great resources and that delivering services around Active Directory on a best effort basis was good enough. We've seen situations where 10,000 employees were sent home for an 8-hour shift because users could not log into AD. We've seen a situation where a transportation network across a continent was shut down for almost 12 hours. It was a Global 2000 company. The CEO is phoning the CIO every hour, and the CIO is sitting beside their best effort engineer who was online with Microsoft doing their best effort to bring Active Directory back online. But their losses over those periods of time in both cases far outweighed what it would have cost to protect against those risks or to build in the necessary resilience to restore their environments within acceptable service levels. These are really big challenges. Now, those examples were due to human error. Today, the problem is much more serious with malicious hackers who may want to damage, demand ransoms, steal intellectual property. Best effort in many ways is just not good enough. We all need to raise our level of maturity in our strategies and execution capabilities, both to block the attacks, but then even more important for that resiliency to be able to respond and restore within acceptable service levels. So today, due to coronavirus, many organizations have rapidly deployed their remote workforce. They've deployed various technologies, quite often in a hurry. That's the continuity aspect. They had to keep business going. They needed to enable the productivity of that workforce. It was a necessary risk. Now, one of the key questions we have to ask ourselves with these newly enabled remote users is this: do you actually know who that remote user is? Are they who they say they are? And you can then ask yourself, if they're not who they say they are, then what are your risks? So when there's been any kind of a breach, we must assume it's malicious. And we must prepare for that by asking, again, the next question, which is, what is your resiliency, your capability to come back and to be tough, to restore, get into an operational state again, continue business as usual. So really, are you tough enough is the way I like to think of it. Sorry, I'm just moving forward. Great. I have a couple of stories I want to tell. The first one I just call a lockdown breach. In mid-March, just as the lockdown started, one of our retail customers, they had several thousand users, they had several hundred outlets, and they experienced a breach, and they lost all their ability due to that breach to take credit card transactions. So the point of entry for the breach was actually thought to be a compromised account. Now, governments were actively discouraging cash transactions because cash is a prime way to spread the coronavirus. But cash was the only way to do business since their authentication systems weren't working, and as a result, their credit card was not, transactions were not working appropriately, and they'd been declared an essential service. They had a huge competitive advantage in their field. Their retail outlets were allowed to be open when others weren't, but they couldn't transact in a safe way. They had to deal in cash. A true crisis. They discovered that the breach had actually attacked their Active Directory, and they worked with a global provider for more than 10 days to try and restore their AD without success. So imagine the pain. Imagine the pain. This is their core business. This is their moment. And here they are, their hands are tied. So finally, they actually turned to us since we'd already implemented and we were managing their Office 365 environment for them. But they had been giving their Azure AD and other environments were managed by others. And they called us in, and within hours, we had brought that Active Directory back to an operational state, and they were able to return to business as usual using their credit card transactions. But what could they have done differently? So this customer had been really slow to implement simple measures that could have removed, the 99% or 99.9% of the risk right up front. Close the door as much as possible. By implementing MFA, for example, multi-factor authentication alone, they could have put some excellent protection on their end user accounts. If they'd been using proper monitoring tools, they could have spotted the breach as it was occurring and not after the negative impact had been felt. We often work together with Quest in this area using some of their tools, such as a Change Auditor to monitor Active Directory accounts and to detect anomalous activities. And with Quest AD tool sets like Recovery Manager for AD, and that's, again, coming on the back end, we can restore AD in a fraction of the time compared to using a lot of the native Microsoft tool sets. This customer knew of these options, had considered them over the past several years, but had not taken action before the crisis happened. Once the crisis is there, it's a completely different game, isn't it? So then we look at the second story. I call this one Doing the Right Thing. And actually, let me just tell you a little about this company. This is a global manufacturing company. They have 75 sites around the world. They have sites in the UK, they have sites in Canada, in the United States, etc. They are hugely impacted already by the global economic downturn in their particular industry. And then when the coronavirus hit, it was even worse. They had to lay off people. They are short-staffed. And this, in turn, just the fact that they were in this tough time and they've had to reduce staff, including in IT, and the impact of that introduces new risks on its own. They saw the risks and they decided to put in place several simple services just before the coronavirus hit. They saw the news from China and they started planning and they acted. That's the big difference. They acted. They implemented multi-factor authentication just before the lockdown. Within the first 2 weeks of lockdown, they had actual evidence of how they had thwarted attacks against privileged accounts that would have brought this global company with 6,000 employees, it could have brought them to its knees without that simple protection. We actually manage their Active Directory. We use Quest, Change Auditor, and Recovery Manager for AD with them. These tools combined with MFA gave them both continuity and resiliency. So it's actually a boring story. Only bad news sells. And I don't have any bad news in this story. I can't shock you on this one, but boring lets you sleep at night. And this is an important thing. So doing the right thing at the right time is really important. When a breach or crisis hits, it's massive. It puts an entire organization at risk. There's no time to talk about continuous improvement processes or planning some incremental protection. So in those moments, you need visibility to make an informed decision fast. Now is the time to think right now, before something happens. It's a time to think through, and I guess to back off a bit, as Colin was saying, and think through where are you at in your particular model. You need a maturity model. It's a time just to plan that out. Right now, our studies show that companies are more at risk than normal because many rapidly deployed remote technologies, they were deploying very, very quickly. People were not doing their normal due diligence for security, for resiliency, and so on. And Itergy is now assisting these companies almost like a second wave. We're assisting them with the necessary tools and processes to put these things in place to avoid a future crisis. So companies have done what's necessary for their business continuity. Now they need to come around and do what's necessary for their IT continuity or their business, their entire digital transformation continuity. For that matter. We have two ways of assisting companies to do that. Companies have different strategies. Some companies have a strategy of outsourcing their work through managed services. So we run managed services which run at a high level of competency already, or if you think of a maturity index, we're functioning at a high level, and companies can instantly be at that level by outsourcing niche managed services to specialists that actually manage at that level. The alternative approach is for a company to say, we do our own managed services, and can you come in and help us to do what you already do? Two approaches to achieve the necessary level of maturity when it comes to putting all these things in place at the tactical level. And so we help our customers with both ways. I just mentioned briefly operational maturity levels. We often think of it as 5 steps. At the beginning, down the bottom left, there's those companies say processes, question mark, and then all the way up to the top on the far right, where you might find the most secure and risk-adverse organizations in financial services and banks and so forth. And a lot of manufacturing companies find themselves in between at a 3, 3.5, and some that really optimize on technology, have a lot of intellectual property to protect and so on. very time-sensitive operations, maybe you have to start creeping up to 4. Your industry needs to be compared to others in your industry and then to your own particular service levels necessary for your organization. We like to talk to our customers and say, okay, what is necessary in your situation, knowing your vertical, and also knowing your particular business goals. And now, where are you today? Determine the difference, the delta, the gap between them, and then putting in a plan to bring it up to that level. Like I said, companies can buy in and use a service that's already functioning at their level, or we can build it together with you. And so that I actually just outlined, I just mentioned the 2 different things. You can do it with project services, sort of go dating together, doesn't matter from time to time, and then we break apart, or the managed services model, which is much more of a long-term commitment, putting that wedding ring on and really being a true partner, working together and outsourcing the SLAs that your business needs. And in both situations, it's always communicate, working together with your partners, whether that be Quest, Itergy, or any others. And finally, Itergy partners with Microsoft, obviously with Active Directory and all of the related tool sets, and with Quest to bring you both the security and the resiliency that you require for your particular kind of business. So the combination of our depth of knowledge and experience, all those some of those stories I've told you, and there's more. I mean, just 2 days ago, again, a partner, 500 users in Azure AD had no access to their Office 365, and here they're all trying to work remote. Imagine none of your productivity tools in Office 365 are working. And again, what happened to those 500 accounts? Colin had to work right away to help them to bring it back into an operational state. This is happening over and over. And we have that expertise, we have the experience, we have the processes and the knowledge, and all those things are necessary, working with identities and Active Directory in the cloud, using partner tools like Quest to monitor, detect, and restore on a timely basis. And then our proprietary services are used around the world. In fact, when it comes to this space, starting with Active Directory and Azure AD and all related things, we actually have a really strong recommendations, top recommendations by Gartner when it comes to this space. We're very proud of that. It's rather unique, but it's extremely important in this day and age. So anyway, that's it. Enough about us. Your situation is much more important. We thank you for joining us today. We encourage you to reach out further to discuss your particular business goals and needs and challenges that you're facing, and see if we can't work together to find solutions to those things. And I'll turn it back again to the others for some question and answers. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ralph. That's really, really good. And I think that's something, I mean, maybe not for you guys as much, but certainly when people view Quest, they see us as a technology company. You know, we just provide software. And like you, we really appreciate it when people come out and ask us, is this a good idea? Even if they're not intent on using our solutions. And that communicate right at the beginning when you're reevaluating your decisions that you made recently, that's the time to start asking. So please reach out to Itergy and they'll reach out to us or whatever you like. But right at the beginning, go through all the decisions that you have made recently, preferably just work ones. We're not too interested in your home life. And then ask Itergy, was this a good idea? Could I have done something better? What can we learn from this? So thank you. And let's hear if there are any questions, because that's always the important bit.
Colin, there are a few questions. I don't know whether you have access to them. But the first question that came was asking about the new normal, saying that if in the new normal, what it's mainly going to be is about meetings, online meetings.
I'm sorry, Floyd, going to have to interrupt you there because your microphone, you're very quiet.
Okay,
and I'd love to guess the question, but yeah, if you don't mind again, what was the question?
Sorry. So the first question that's come along was discussing, saying, if in the new normal now, online meetings are going to be more prevalent than face-to-face meetings, does the panel believe that the recording and the security measures around those recordings are enough?
That's an interesting point, because we're rapidly adopting new technologies. We're often making decisions based on ubiquity rather than having the opportunity to go through and work out whether they're really secure end-to-end, where their partners are, where they're based, where the data is based. And it really depends on what you're discussing. So common communications, we saw early days with Zoom, massive adoption because they were prevalent throughout, easy to use, good license plan. And then they had a bug. Now, they were great because they fixed that really, really quick. But you can't rely on organizations doing that. So it really depends on the kind of communications that you're having. If they're to discuss intellectual property, maybe you should consider one of the other mainstream closed loop services, such as maybe Teams or something like that.
A slight adage to that question was, who owns the data? So, and therefore, who is responsible for the security of the recording?
Actually, you know what? I had a fascinating conversation with someone yesterday on who owns the data. We often look at the contracts when we're signing up, and this is outside of just video conferencing, it's any service that we ever look for or use. We often look at the security model, where the data will be and so on. The most risky time for data isn't when you sign up, it's when you leave that service, because you effectively lose control of the data and yet you may still be responsible for it. So always understand your get out of jail clause. Can you enforce data deletion? Who owns it? If you're using, for example, Google Drive to share data, hopefully not, but they actually say in their T's and C's, they own the data. They can use the data for any way they like. Same with other services. So it's careful consideration of who owns that data during the use and post-use, because that organization you used may have legal obligations locally at where they're based or at a global level that require them to keep a certain amount of data as well. So yeah, thanks, Floyd.
Okay. We've got well, it wasn't my question, it was from the floor. We've got another one. We mentioned the word breach. So it says, how would you define a breach, given that a breach is defined as breaches of integrity and or availability, as well as confidentiality? That's the question.
So an interesting question, because the definition of a breach would differ from a data protection officer to a security officer as such, or even as the business is concerned. So a breach is, from a data protection perspective, is any unauthorized access, loss or destruction of the data. Now that's important to know, so that if you actually don't have a recovery for data that you are expected to keep on the behalf of your clients or individuals, so employees as well as customers, then that is a breach if it's destroyed or if it's unofficially disclosed. But again, when we're looking at a corporate breach, that's where we go back to what is material impact for us, and that would include things like the breach of personal information. But again, intellectual property. So I always class a breach as something that results in an effect on your material asset to the organization.
Scrolling through to see. In terms of proving who is remotely accessing, does multi-factor authentication really work?
Actually, so I think I get where they're saying. So they're saying, is 2FA actually a good step? And 2FA on its own, it isn't. It's a good way of getting there, but you can't rely on 2FA completely. For one thing, how you're issuing that two-factor authentication, and it's also, again, very binary. You're looking at the identity, and then as soon as you've proved it, having unfettered, unmonitored access in the normal way of looking through, or the traditional way of looking at things. What you should be doing is combining it with things like usage analytics and a much more granular approach. So 2FA, very, very important, but I wouldn't class it as the ultimate answer in any way. And also you've got to look at the way you're implementing that two-factor authentication. Some services are very good where there's no data transmitted in the clear. It's an application on your phone, for example, as long as nobody else has access to the application. 2FA can be duped. We've heard stories of when people have been called by the attacker saying, I'm about to send you a code to test that you've got your phone. Please read that code out to me to make sure it's you. Because literally they're just asking for the 2FA code. So we need to consider how it's being implemented and also the underlying technology. Avoid systems that rely on email and texting, for example, which can easily be subversed. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
Right, so another one. How does the new approach that was presented work with more traditional methodologies like ISO 27K? Are the approaches in any way contradictory, prevent a company being certified?
No, I wouldn't say they're contradictory. The thing about ISOs, well, all the ISO standards, but you're proving a process. You have processes in place, and there's certain checkpoints that you need to show that you can demonstrate to achieve those. I have never heard of an organization that has gone down the route of a very granular zero trust, always verify, least privileged access from losing their certification or failing certification. The thing you've got to bear in mind is the certification appropriate for you? Industry standards. And Quest has the 2001 certification, for example, for its development and its online services, as well as many other processes within our organization. So that's relevant to us because we get asked that a lot, and it's important to prove our position in the supply chain as a reliable set of hands. So hopefully that helps. And remember, certification, when you're asking the question of your suppliers and people, have you got this certification? That question normally then only is asked again on a scheduled basis, hopefully more than once a year, but often it's just once a year on a review. That should be asked directly after implementation as well, because there may have been changes made to the implementation of a service to enable you to adopt it that were not originally considered and documented that may affect your own certification. It's a bit of a wraparound answer of that, sorry.
I think we have time for I'm just going to give one more because we're fast approaching the hour. And it's just really what the panel's thoughts are of the use of biometrics in the future as being the way ahead. What are your thoughts of biometrics?
Shall I go first, and then I'll throw it over to Ralph to actually answer that from his perspective, because he's got a lot of practical experience there. I specialize in data privacy, so I come at this from a particular angle for biometrics. We've got to remember that biometrics on our personal devices, our phones and things like that, are designed for ease of use. So they're not locked down the same way that you would see used via MOD or secure systems that you put in your own environments. So trusting the biometrics on a phone it's certainly better than just simply trusting a password, which can be reshared. Hopefully you're not going to reshare your face or fingerprints. It can be subverted. The other danger is if that core information is lost, if you store the raw information, which happened in the UK end of last year, you then are in danger of placing the data subjects at significant risk. And the biometrics can be anything from your fingerprints, as I said, your face, and the way you walk, so depending on what you're tracing. So just be aware that if it's a system designed for usability, they've downgraded the accuracy.
Yeah. So I could add to that too. So again, when we talk about breaches, and then Colin presented it, there's one of the highest risks is actually not the external breach, but more of that internal one. And so once you let someone in, if it's actually a legitimate employee who has a right to be in, at that point, a lot of the tools that if a hacker would succeed somehow in getting in using some sort of biometrics. They can, of course, use all kinds of tools to do their damage from there. But more important is that employee, him or herself, who may either inadvertently or deliberately sabotage, steal information, and so on. And this is a big challenge. So, and I think I raised the question too. So is this person who they say they are? Is an important question. But now, are they doing things that they shouldn't be doing? And at that point, you don't have any choice but to start integrating tool sets in that I can actually start monitoring and know the regular habits, the kind of information that employee accesses, and can actually detect and alert, wait a second, this employee, yes, it is who he says or who she says they are. However, this employee is now accessing information and downloading information or deleting information that they have never had access to before. They have never done this behavior. Alert comes up, monitor, react, and try and stop it or whatever the appropriate response is at that time. So we definitely have to work with our customers in that area, because the majority of these kinds of things are still happening through a legitimate user. So yeah, we've got to close the barn door, but wow, once it's in or out, depending on the direction you're thinking, we have to have a whole set of different response mechanisms. So it requires a plan that goes from beginning, right from beginning through to end. Do the maximum we can to block external people. And it's complex. Financial Times this morning, there was articles on how complex it is for the traders, where historically they have physical separation from listening ears out there, and now when they're working at home, all of a sudden there's different ears listening to highly confidential information. You have a professional spouse in the next room that's doing something else. They overhear something, and all of a sudden now you've got something that IT can't even protect against. So there's a lot of aspects to this. Working from home has introduced new risks, and those risks are a little more complex than perhaps we realized. So there's a lot of things going on there. Anyway, that gives a bit of feedback on how we see that.
I like that answer, Ralph. Okay, so I think we may have time for just one more, and anything else that we've missed, we shall contact independently. And this one, it just literally says, does zero trust result in a closed community and reliance on the service?
That's interesting. Does zero trust result in a
So
closed
the
community? No, I think that's it's taking the concept of zero trust from a human perspective, maybe not looking at it from a technological perspective. If we're zero trust from a human perspective, we're basically turning around and saying, I work with you, but I don't trust you, or you work for me, I trust none of you. And it's the assumption of trust that is the question here, not whether you personally trust them or not. And you wouldn't have hired that person, hopefully, if you didn't have some degree that they weren't going to threaten your organization or be a liability. So, but at the same time, we've got to be careful about where we're making assumptions. And from a technological perspective, rather than just blindly assuming that someone is who they say they are, as Ralph already indicated, especially when we're working from home, we need to start layering on things to prove that these really are the people that we think they are, internally and externally, because that identity of no fault to the actual physical individual could well have been compromised. And if an email comes from an internal resource that you know and trust and says, hey, can you send me this financial file? You will respond. How do you know that is really that person? How do you know that person should actually have access to that data in the first place or at that particular time? So zero trust is actually putting in places again to slow down that attack vector, the sequence of events, make it more difficult to compromise the true identity, and to also make sure that we have the underlying principle of accountability as well. We're not assuming you have rights to that, you can do what you like, you will be a good person. We're assuming that you have rights to that, but we are going to monitor what's going on, and we've proved who you are.
On that note, we've literally got 6 minutes to the hour, so I think we should start wrapping up here. And what I'd like to do is to thank everybody for the time that they've given, and on behalf of Quest and Itergy, I hope that you found this a useful use of your time. And what we will do is we will email everybody that attended a recording of this session, of which you could forward on to other people. For any of the questions that we were unable to answer, we've got a collection of them here in the chat. We will respond to you individually with those. And as I say, on behalf of Itergy and Quest, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and hope that you have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.